Think planting trees is the ultimate climate fix. Maybe think again. Today, we're diving into some really interesting research. It suggests our love for trees might actually be blinding us to other crucial carbon removal solutions.
Yeah.
And if you're someone who wants to really get to grips with a topic, well, let's unpack this surprising dynamic.
That's right. We're going to explore why this idea, which seems so simple, so universally accepted, could inadvertently be hindering the development of a more effective range of methods for tackling climate change.
Okay.
Our main source for this deep dive is an article, pretty recent, in a Nature Portfolio journal. It's called Carbon Removal Beyond the Trees.
Right. Beyond the trees. Okay, so the core idea we're digging into today is this. Our, deeply ingrained positive feelings about something as seemingly good as planting trees might actually be a hurdle, a significant one in our broader climate strategy. So our mission is to understand why that might be the case and what it means for real climate action.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's start with the basics then. Why are we all so drawn to planting trees?
Well, it's so intuitive, isn't it? I mean, most of us learn about photosynthesis way back in school.
Right.
Where this elegant way trees just soak up carbon dioxide. And, the idea of plants purifying the air, that actually goes back centuries, 18th century even.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah. So compared to a lot of other carbon removal tech that feels maybe new, complex, tree planting is familiar.
Familiar, yes.
We see it happening already, sometimes on a really large scale.
It's almost the default image, isn't it? That kind of archetypal picture that pops into your head when you think about taking CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Exactly.
But this article really highlights that relying too heavily on trees, like this single silver bullet, well, it comes with some pretty significant limitations.
Absolutely it does. If you look at current climate pledges, many depend heavily, maybe too heavily, on tree planting. We're talking requirements for land area roughly the size of the entire European Union.
That's huge.
It's massive. And while trees do store carbon, sure, it's not necessarily permanent storage. That's the key thing.
Right, because they're vulnerable.
Exactly. Vulnerable to wildfires, which we see more of, disease, changes in how the land is managed. All these things can release that stored CO2 right back into the atmosphere.
So it's not locked away forever.
Not necessarily. And to manage those risks effectively, we really, really need a diverse portfolio of carbon removal methods, not just trees.
Which brings us, I guess, to the central argument of this research. This idea that our strong positive feelings about trees can actually create a negative bias against other techniques.
Precisely. And this isn't just like a hunch. The researchers mentioned multiple projects they've run, around the world actually, that have consistently pointed towards this effect.
So what's going on there psychologically? Why does that happen?
Well, it's fascinating. A key factor seems to be this perception of tampering with nature. For many people, trees are just the quintessential symbol of nature, aren't they? Plus, they offer all these co-benefits we like for ecosystems, biodiversity. But it's important to remember, the article points this out too, that what we consider a natural climate solution, well, that's really a social construct. Depends on context, culture.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We just feel trees are inherently good, inherently natural. The article also mentions familiarity, right?
Yes, familiarity is big. We grow up around trees. Many of us feel a personal connection to forests, maybe places we visited as kids.
Sure.
And that familiarity could lead us to perceive less risk with tree planting compared to these newer, less familiar technologies. It feels safer.
Right. And you said there's evidence for this biasing effect. It's not just theory.
No, not just theory. They share some pretty compelling stuff from their studies. For instance, back in a 2018 project, they found that when they included afforestation, that's planting new forests. When that was part of the discussion about carbon removal, it became really difficult to talk about other techniques, like direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture.
Sure.
What happened? Participants just kept circling back to trees. Why should they even consider these other, maybe more engineered alternatives when you could just plant trees? It sort of dominated the conversation.
Wow. So the sheer presence of this well-liked option just overshadowed everything else.
Pretty much. And it wasn't a one-off finding either. They mention a national survey, UK and US, where they asked people what first came to mind when they heard carbon dioxide removal.
And the answer was?
The most common answer, by far, was simply trees.
Just trees.
Yeah. Then, more recently, a 2023 UK project focused specifically on biological carbon removal, so things like biochar, restoring peatlands.
Right. Other nature-based ideas.
Exactly. And even though the researchers deliberately avoided mentioning tree planting in that study,
Participants brought it up anyway.
they brought it up themselves, unprompted. Some even questioned why it wasn't included, seeing it as the obvious, natural solution compared to these other methods, which some described as seeming huge or industrial.
The article includes some quotes too, doesn't it?
It does, and they really illustrate the point. Someone in Wales, for example, said they'd be much more supportive of initiatives focused on restoration, planting trees, restoring things, rather than destroying and creating.
That really paints a picture, doesn't it? Tree planting as good, restorative, other methods as potentially destructive.
Exactly, and it taps into that feeling that planting trees is like reversing some of the damage we've done. Plus, the co-benefits keep coming up.
Like biodiversity.
Yeah, participants mention how trees provide resources for people, animals, they boost biodiversity, and there's also this perception sometimes that trees offer a quicker fix.
Which is appealing, given the climate urgency.
Very appealing. So the underlying question people seem to ask is, why bother with these other, maybe more complex, maybe more costly technologies when we have this seemingly great natural solution right here?
And this isn't just a UK or US thing, you said. The research looked globally.
That's right. They did a big survey across 30 countries and also ran focus groups in 22 countries, trying to get a good mix from the global north and global south.
And what did they find globally? Same pattern.
What's really striking is the consistency. Afforestation, planting new forests, and reforestation, replanting existing ones, weren't just the most familiar options everywhere. They were also the most strongly supported globally. And interestingly, support for tree planting was one of the few areas where there wasn't a big difference between the global north and south. It suggests a truly widespread positive view.
Wow. Universal appeal, almost.
Almost. And the qualitative data, from the focus groups really brings this home. People talked about biological carbon removal, especially tree planting, as something tangible.
Something you can see and do?
Exactly. Distributed, empowering. It gives individuals a sense that they can contribute to solving this huge problem. This positive view, natural, feasible, giving people agency, it came through in all 22 countries.
So that's the view of trees. How did people then see the more engineered options like direct air capture?
Well, when participants compared them, the contrasts were pretty stark. Engineered solutions were often viewed as costly, very resource intensive.
Okay.
And maybe even tied to the very industrial processes, the fossil fuels that cause climate change in the first place. There was some skepticism there.
The article shares some quotes on that too, I remember.
Yes, really telling ones. Someone in Turkey, for instance, said planting a tree is the easiest and most effective way and the most harmless and most beneficial way. Just totally positive.
Right.
And in Brazil, a participant described tree planting as taking advantage of natural resources and just being more natural than chemical processes. It really highlights this deep preference.
This idea of going back to nature.
Exactly. That theme came up again and again, reversing humanity's impact. People talked about stopping deforestation, replanting, viewing it as taking care of what we have, recreating what we've lost. There was even, in some cases, a degree of perhaps over-optimism, people suggesting that large-scale afforestation could be, a simple and complete fix for high temperatures and carbon emissions.
Which we know isn't quite the case.
Right. It's part of the puzzle, but not the whole solution.
Now, it's important to add some nuance here, isn't it?
Yeah.
The researchers mentioned that this preference isn't always simplistic. People do see some downsides to trees.
That's a crucial point, yes. It's not that people are totally blind. Participants did recognize some risks and trade-offs with tree planting, like competition for land needed for food, for example.
Land use, yeah.
And the impermanence issue we talked about, the carbon being released again. So there is some awareness of the complexities.
And support for things like direct air capture isn't zero everywhere.
No, definitely not. The article notes that in some countries, technologies like DDAC still have considerable public support, so it's not an entirely black and white picture.
Okay. But the main takeaway still holds.
The overall conclusion, yes, seems to be that the very idea of planting trees for carbon removal can indeed bias public perception against other necessary techniques.
And that's a problem, because we need everything we can get, basically.
It presents a significant challenge, yeah, because we need a whole toolkit, a comprehensive set of solutions to really make a dent in climate change.
So if this natural, maybe even slightly romanticist view of nature, tied so strongly to trees, is creating this bias. What can actually be done about it?
That's the big question. The article suggests we might need to think carefully about how we communicate these different approaches.
Like how?
Well, one potential strategy could be to try and emphasize the natural elements that might be present in all climate interventions, even the more technological ones. Sort of level the playing field in public perception.
Interesting. Frame them differently.
Or, conversely, maybe another approach is to actually highlight the significant technology, logistics, and infrastructure that's involved in doing tree planting at scale. To challenge that idea that it's purely some untouched, simple, natural solution.
Make it seem less purely natural itself.
Perhaps. But ultimately, the researchers really stress the need for more targeted research. We need to empirically test and understand the extent of this bias and why it happens much better.
Get more solid data on the effect.
Exactly. And they also offer a caution for policymakers.
Which is?
Basically, don't misuse the public's enthusiasm for tree planting. For example, through promoting poor quality carbon forestry credits or enabling land grabs disguised as planting projects.
Right. Avoid the greenwashing pitfalls.
Precisely. They even suggest maybe we should focus tree planting policies more on all those other great benefits trees provide.
Biodiversity, flood prevention, air quality, well-being.
Exactly. All those things, and maybe be a bit more realistic about relying on them solely for the carbon removal aspect at massive scales.
That makes sense.
Because understanding how public opinion shifts and evolves, that's going to be really crucial if we want to successfully scale up some of these other more innovative carbon removal approaches in the coming years.
So let's try and wrap this up. The core insight here seems pretty stark, really. Our deep positive feelings about planting trees, which feel so right, so natural, might actually be a significant hurdle.
A hurdle in our broader climate strategy.
Yeah. So while our affection for planting trees is, well-intentioned, totally understandable, it might be inadvertently overshadowing other vital climate solutions we urgently need to develop and roll out.
Exactly. We really need a broader public understanding and acceptance of a whole diverse portfolio of carbon removal methods if we're serious about tackling climate change effectively. It can't just be trees.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much do our gut feelings, our inherent positive associations with nature, shape our willingness to embrace maybe more novel or technological approaches to climate change?
Right.
And what could be the long-term consequences if that influence holds us back? It's definitely something for you, the listener, to mull over as you hear about different perspectives on carbon removal and that whole range of solutions being developed.